Good morning, everyone. We're here today, of course, to continue our study on energy security in Canada, including looking at what the federal role in unconventional oil and gas development, such as deep water, offshore drilling, shale gas exploration, and oil sands development may be, regional economic impacts of oil and gas development, and the National Energy Board's role in the development and export of unconventional resources. So we're continuing our study on that, and we have two panels today. The first from 11 till noon and the second noon till 1. And we have here on the first panel by video conference from Edmonton, Alberta, from the Oil Sands Developers Group, Don Thompson, President. Welcome, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you for having me.
And we have from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, Lionel Lepine, Traditional Environmental Knowledge Coordinator, Industry Relations. Welcome, Mr. Lepine. And we have, as an individual, Ezra Levant. So we'll take the presentations in the order listed on the agenda, starting with from up to 7 minutes, if you could, with your presentations, starting with Mr. Thompson from the Oil Sands Developers Group. Go ahead, please, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My presentation materials, I trust, made it there, and they're in front of you. I have no intent in going over in detail. I wanted to give you the highlights. First of all, to introduce Oil Sands Developers Group, we began in 1997. You can see from our committee structure on page 1, we are primarily focused on local issues impacting oil sands, but we will deal with issues wherever they exist with respect to our industry. I think the first thing people should know is that there are two things driving the need for energy, whether it is around the world or, in fact, in Canada, and that is the number of people and their lifestyles. They are growing in all dimension. I think I want to see improvements in people's lifestyle all around the world, including in Canada, and our population continues to grow. Energy demand, therefore, continues to grow, as shown on page 3. You will note it particularly grows in non-OECD nations. Page 4, even including oil sands, which is that tan-colored non-conventional line, you will see that the global energy picture requires about 64 million barrels a day of new capacity to be found by 2030. Global depletion rates are in and around the order of 4 million barrels per day per year. Finding rates are about half of that. Canada, the global energy mix dominated by oil. Canada has a slightly different energy mix, as shown on page 6, primarily in that hydroelectric power, which we happen to be blessed with in certain regions of Canada, has offset coal. But you will notice that our requirements for oil are not dissimilar to other countries nor around the world, some 32% of our energy mix being from oil. Page 7, I think, is instructive, laying out reserves position around the world. You will note that Canada is second in terms of global oil reserves at 178 billion barrels. You should note 95% of those, or 170 billion barrels, are in fact oil sands. The question you should ask yourself in viewing this chart is, if we did not have the oil sands, from where would we be getting our oil? I draw your attention to Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Venezuela. These are the places to which we would be turning if we did not have oil sands. Leaving aside the issues that I'm sure Mr. Levant will talk about, you also should know that increasingly these countries are turning to the non-OECD nations for their market, they being closer, having a higher netback. Interestingly enough, Saudi Arabia's shipments to North America seem to be dwindling in favor of those other markets. That is certainly true with Venezuela. On page 8, I want to draw your attention to two things. Firstly, 20% only of the resource in the oil sands is mineable. This is the resource less than 70 meters deep. This is the resource that was initiated first because the technology was available. It has only been about 12 or 13 years since the bulk of the oil sands, that being the in situ portion, 80% of the resource too deep to be mined, was in fact commercialized. If you look at the existing and proposed projects, right now operating is a capacity of 1.7 million barrels a day. Last year, that capacity expressed itself in production of 1.4 million barrels, a number of new projects not fully ramped up. Under construction, another 600,000 barrels, and with regulatory or under regulatory review, sufficient capacity to take us to the 3.5 to 4 million barrel a day range. The oil sands is a huge driver of Canada's economy. I need not underscore that, but the bottom line of the Canadian Energy Research Institute shows about $1.7 trillion of GDP and 456,000 jobs across all the markets in Canada. On page 11, just to highlight, we value as an industry development of strong business relationships. One of those objectives is to increase participation locally and certainly on Aboriginal businesses. When we first were formed, we did a survey, this is in 1997, showing that our members did about $80 million a year in Aboriginal business. We have almost increased that by a factor of 10. Last year it was $711 million. Similarly, on direct employment with my members, we have moved from 80 in 1998 to over 1,600 self-reporting Aboriginals now employed directly with my members, and of course many more in those businesses. This is an industry that donates substantial amounts to the community for hospital, recreation, cultural, educational factors. On page 13, this is an industry that by any measure has world-class environmental monitoring and management. I know of no other air monitoring network as large in terms of scope or in terms of geographic extent than the Wood Buffalo Environmental Association. You may take a look at their website in real time, see the air quality from any region or any area of the region. Similarly, the Aquatics Monitoring Program, $4 million a year spent on monitoring chemical, physical, and biological properties of the river, and all of the cumulative effects management frameworks developed and recommended through the Cumulative Environmental Management Association. Benchmarked by Cambridge Energy Research, this is also an industry that has world-class regulatory processes in place, including agencies from the Government of Alberta, quasi-judicial regulatory agencies from Alberta and from Canada. On page 15, I draw your attention to the fact that technology development will continue to be a key enabler of growth. That 170 billion barrels of reserves is U.S. SEC qualified, which is to say that it is producible at today's economics and at today's technology. It is about 10 to 17% of the geologic resource. Particularly in the in situ, but also in the mining area, new technologies are coming aplenty. The focus in the in situ business is to drive down the energy and water use and to drive up recovery. A tremendous range of new technologies we can explore, but not in 7 minutes. So if you have questions, I'd be pleased. The mining area of research focus is particularly on tailings use, moving, of course, towards drier tailings, and on minimization of water use, not to say there aren't other focuses. On slide 16, I get to the recommendations, my comments. First of all, in terms of what the OSDG members will continue to do with respect to advancing responsible development in the oil sands, we will do what we do best, which is to continue to seek out and develop economic investments and then operate the facilities that we have in a safe, reliable, and environmentally responsible manner. That is our primary contribution to the energy security and economic prosperity of both our province and our nation. Secondly, we will continue to communicate and discharge our responsibilities for consultation, particularly with respect to Aboriginal consultation. Thirdly, we will continue to focus on technology development and innovation, primarily to increase the proportion of the resource that can be produced, and also to improve our environmental performance. I would draw your attention to the fact that I have at least 4 members who have their own internal research priorities and who fund it to the tune of over $100 million a year. There are also many very entrepreneurial in situ companies who are pushing the technology envelope very hard. We will continue to work with the regional municipality and the province to ensure the physical and social infrastructure is in place to support the requirements of our industry. In that regard, we particularly focus locally on transportation, on infrastructure, on housing, on health care, and the like. That is evident in the structure of our organization. We will continue to contribute to the ongoing development of the communities we operate in. Donations and support of our employees to educational, recreational, and cultural facilities. Similarly, we will continue to develop the workforce of the future. We have created and supported many organizations to do so, particularly draw your attention to Careers the Next Generation, and also to funding and support of things like Keano College, NAIT, SAIT, and apprenticeship programs. We will continue to ensure that monitoring and reporting in the region is state-of-the-art and transparent. And finally, we will be continuing to engage and contribute to the ongoing dialogue in Canada about energy and environmental policy generally and the oil sands specifically. In terms of what I think governments should have as their key elements going forward, I would say first and foremost, leading and contributing to honest conversations about energy and the environment. I think the fact is we all need to be willing to be transparent about the real-world choices that are available and the time frames within which these choices may be operative. I think we need to make sure that people understand the impacts and implications of these different policy choices and how they will impact energy consumers across Canada. I seek a policy environment for Canada that recognizes our specific geographic and energy circumstances. We are a nation founded on an export-based economy. It is not warm in Edmonton today. I don't know what it is in Ottawa. And we also have a country with low population density, large distances, and the like. I think we need energy policy that not only advances but balances the 3 key dimensions of our interests. Firstly, economic interests. Secondly, energy security and reliability of supply. And thirdly, of course, environmental performance. We need policy environment that maintains open borders and trade with and market access to our largest trading partner, the United States, but also offshore markets. And we need a policy environment that is founded on economy-wide solutions, ensuring competitiveness and stimulating investment, particularly in the use of technology and innovation. So, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I thank you for your time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thompson. And we now go directly to Mr. Lionel Lapine from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. Go ahead, please, for up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity for the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation to address this committee in this important topic which concerns our people today. I'm honored to come and hear and tell you about some of the pressing issues that may severely affect energy security in Canada. As you may know, the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation is the ACFN's traditional territories cover much of the mineable and non-mineable oil sands in the Athabasca region of northern Alberta. On his famous voyages, guided by the Dene people, Alexander Mackenzie used one of those same tar sands exposed along the shores of the Athabasca River to waterproof his canoes, as did the Dene people. Now, some 230 years later, estimates put the oil reserves in the tar sands at hundreds of billions of barrels, making it the second largest deposit of oil in the world next to Saudi Arabia. Although estimates may vary, there is certainly enough oil to meet Canada's foreseeable security needs and allow significant exports of oil as well. These reserves are so attractive that companies and governments from all corners of the world are rushing into Alberta, especially the ACFN's traditional territory, to participate in this bounty of petroleum wealth. This rush of activity has been called the largest and most destructive industrial project in the world. The lands torn apart are clearly visible from space with the naked eye. You may think this is all good and economically safe, but unfortunately, it is obvious that this greed for oil has created huge impacts in the region and, more importantly, impacts on our Aboriginal and treaty rights to continue the use of our traditional territory. Now, there are proposals to double and or triple again the number of oil sand projects in our area, which will significantly increase the impacts and erase our ability to practice our treaty rights granted to us 100 plus years ago. Unlike previous debates, we have enough oil to meet our oil security demands. Instead, the problem is the safe, proper and fair development and production of existing oil reserves. The question is, what environmental and human costs must Canadians pay for this oil, and will this price be excessively loaded on the backs of the ACFN and other First Nation peoples of the area? Our governments cannot tell you the answers to these questions because they simply do not know the answers to these. The Alberta government is taking a minimalist approach with respect to our treaty rights to securely use our traditional territory. As a result, the ACFN's rights are being eroded, and the Government of Canada has been standing back and allowing this breach to occur. Face-to-face consultation with governments and oil sands impacts is non-existent, leaving ACFN little choice but to mount challenges such as court actions and media campaigns. As we speak, recent technical reports have shown large holes in the existing monitoring processes for chemical exposure, and no resolution of the cumulative impacts is being sought. The honour of the Crown is at stake here. Instead of making absurd legal arguments, the provincial and federal Crown representatives have a duty to properly engage the ACFN with proper face-to-face, government-to-government consultation, which must include mitigation and accommodation of environmental and economic impacts. If proper consultation is not undertaken, oil sands projects may be threatened and the resulting oil production in question. If proper consultation is not undertaken, the negative environmental impacts may be irreversible and ultimately devastating to the Aboriginal communities in northern Alberta and up into the NWT, the Northwest Territories. If you ask what the energy security issues are in the Canadian oil sands, the answer is dealing with the huge impacts on the Aboriginal rights and on the environment. Currently, the consultation support process is in a dividing line. The provincial government is attempting, with success, to delegate their responsibilities to consult to industry, even on regional issues, even on issues which involve regional non-specific effects. Despite continuous appeals to both levels of government, there has been no direct Crown consultation, and as a result of this lack of consultation, 1, ACFN rights are being eroded, and our ability to use the lands is completely impaired. 2, the Athabasca River water testing has come under a lot of scrutiny because of questionable monitoring practices. 3, human impacts, particularly with the respect of high cancer rates in Fort Chipewyan, have become a crucial issue. And 4, endangered species, wildlife habitat, and their food sources are now threatened without mitigation processes. Lack of consultation will result in more court battles, such as the West Morley First Nations case in our Treaty 8 area, where a coal mining project has been stopped due to lack of consultation with respect to endangered caribou. Now, woodland caribou are now threatened. They're on the verge of extinction in northern Alberta, and it is very important to the ACFN and the oil sands area, as that's one of our main substance of diets traditionally. In summary, the ACFN submits that oil energy security is not a matter of having enough oil, but a matter of the proper development of huge existing reserves. Canada's energy security is challenged by the failure of the Crown to properly consult on the massive impacts of the largest industrial project in the world. This development is in our backyards. It's in the ACFN's front and backyards. This is a type of intensive development the Supreme Court of Canada referred to when they required the Crown to intensely consult with Aboriginal peoples. We are asking that the governments of Canada and Alberta live up to these constitutional responsibilities, and if they do, they would also protect the security of Canadian energy. So I'd like to thank you for this time to allow me to speak.
And thank you very much, Mr. Lepine, for your presentation. And we go finally to Mr. Ezra Levant. Go ahead, please, Mr. Levant.
Thanks for the invitation to be here. One day we might discover a fuel source with no environmental side effects that's affordable and practical, but until that day comes, we need oil. Not just for us, but but the United States, to whom we sell 1.4 million barrels of oil sands oil every day. And last year, for the first time, more cars were sold in China than in the U.S., and they all want to be two-car families, too, and the same for India and the rest of the developing world. So the choice isn't oil sands oil versus some fantasy fuel of the future. It's oil sands oil versus oil from other places where it comes from, mainly OPEC countries. I don't know what God was thinking when he was handing out oil, but he gave it to all the world's bastards. I mean, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela, Nigeria. One out of the top 10 countries ranked by oil reserves, Canada is the only Western liberal democracy on the list. Now, that doesn't matter if all you care about is driving your car. I mean, it all burns the same. But what about the ethics of oil? In my book, Ethical Oil, which I'd be happy to give, courtesy of my publisher, everyone a copy here afterwards, I suggest 4 liberal values by which we should judge the morality of a barrel of oil. Respect for the environment, peace, fair wages for workers, and human rights. I compare oil sands oil to OPEC oil using these 4 measures. I come to the conclusion that oil sands oil is the fair trade coffee of the world's oil industry. Take the environment. Greenpeace propaganda pictures make the oil sands look like something out of the land of Mordor in Lord of the Rings. But in only 2% of the area, where 20% of the resource is the oil close enough to the surface for it to be mined that way. The rest of it has to be got underground or in situ in methods that don't tear up the surface. They don't use any river water, and even that 2% that is mined has to be reclaimed afterwards. And already more than 60 square kilometers has been. Compare that to the 2,000 unremediated toxic oil spills in Nigeria that'll never be cleaned up. And then there's carbon dioxide. Using the Obama administration's well-to-wheels analysis, oil sands oil has the same carbon footprint as oil from Nigeria or Iraq because they waste so much natural gas, but we have a lower carbon footprint than U.S. imports from Venezuela, and much less carbon than oil from Nancy Pelosi's own state, which is actually called California Heavy, for a reason. So if you're concerned with carbon emissions, shouldn't we replace higher carbon oil from Venezuela and California with our lower carbon oil sands oil? And since 1990, the carbon footprint of the average barrel of oil sands oil has fallen by 38%. I can hardly wait to see where it's going to be 10 years from now. But the environment is not the only measure of ethics. What about peace? Canada invented peacekeeping. Saudi Arabia invented 9/11. Iran is using its oil profits to build a nuclear bomb. Sudan uses its oil profits to buy weapons to prosecute the genocide in Darfur. If you multiply 300,000 murders in Darfur by 185 ounces of blood per human body, and you divide it into the number of barrels of oil exported by Sudan over the same period of time, it works out to 6.5 milliliters of blood in every damn barrel. That would fill a lipstick tube. What about fair wages, though? Fort McMurray is Canada's wealthiest city and the most generous, according to the United Way. And the working poor there, the lowest quartile, have 77% more purchasing power than in other cities like Edmonton. Compare that to Saudi Arabia, which uses poorly paid migrant laborers who have no civil rights. Or Nigeria, where over $300 billion has been stolen by dictators and bureaucrats, leaving the country one of the poorest on earth. And then there's human rights. The mayor of Fort McMurray is a young woman named Melissa Blake. How many women mayors are there in Saudi Arabia? There are none. It's against the law. In Iran, women are stoned to death if they're accused of adultery. Ahmadinejad says there are no gays in Iran. And you know, he's not lying, because when he finds them, he kills them. And then there's the fact that the oil sands are Canada's largest employer of Aboriginal people. Not only nearly 2,000 direct jobs, but billions more to Aboriginal-owned businesses. If you don't care about morality, then buy oil from Iran or Sudan. It's just as good as Canadian oil. But if you believe in making the world a better place, then the moral imperative is to replace unethical OPEC oil with Canadian green oil, conflict-free oil, fair wage oil, human rights oil. The leader of the opposition says it's important to increase trade with China and India. I agree. Right now, those countries are forced to buy terrorist oil, dictatorship oil, Darfur oil, because we only let Americans buy our oil right now. I love our American neighbors, but it's dangerous to have just one customer for our product. We're at the mercy of protectionism and taxes, and sometimes we're taken for granted. That's why the pipeline to the West Coast makes so much strategically important sense. It makes us an independent country with options. I find it very irritating that so many of the anti-oil sands activists are taking their funding from U.S. lobby groups like the Tides Foundation. Of course it's in America's interest that no other customers be able to buy our Canadian oil. But it's in Canada's interest that we are able to sell to whomever we choose. And if you care about industrial ethics, it's in the world's interest too. A lot of people are watching how Canada is handling the oil sands. Not just Canadians. The American ambassador is watching too. He hopes the pipeline's shut down so he can have the oil all to himself. The Saudi ambassador is watching too. Maybe they're watching together. I don't know. He hopes the pipeline's killed also so he doesn't lose any market share in Asia like he's lost in the United States. But for those who love Canada, expanding the oil sands is the right thing for our country and for those who think globally and act locally, because every barrel of oil sands oil we can sell to Asia or the United States is one less barrel sold by the world's terrorists and dictators. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Levant. So we've heard the presentations. We will go directly to questions or comments. Monsieur Coderre for up to 7 minutes.
So I love Canada. I'll build a pipeline. All right. Mr. Thompson, I want to be nice because you might say bad thing like you said about Julian Assange and your Toronto Sun. I might have a contract on my head with you. Mr. Thompson, seriously though, because it is a serious issue, it is a strategic resource. And before asking question, I felt it was more appropriate for me to visit Fort McMurray, and I spoke to most of the stakeholders, including the First Nation, and I will have a question to Mr. Lipin later on. There is an issue of perception, maybe. There is an issue of lack of inclusiveness, or there are some people who are talking about the lack of monitoring. I saw all your numbers. I heard about your numbers. Why do you think that you might have some people who truly feel that your figures regarding the toxicity and all that are not accurate? Is there something more that you should have done? Because when I spoke about the First Nation said, well, they're not part of the deal. The answers sometimes from your group are saying, well, we hire more Aboriginal people and they're part of it. They talk about Fort McKay and all that. It is clearly a strategic resource, but you cannot do it at any cost. The issue of environment is also important, so it's kind of it's not a menu a la carte, it's a 1-2 punch here. What do you feel, for the sake of our study, the industry should do better to make sure that from coast to coast to coast, people might think that it is that important that we should expand?
So I think pardon me?
Go ahead, Mr. Thompson. Yeah.
Okay, I think the number one thing, and I've said it in my comments, is we need to communicate much more broadly. I think it's fair to say that while we were developing the technology, while we were making it robust and investable, we did not spend much time talking to our stakeholders, particularly stakeholders beyond Fort McMurray. Into that void leapt others. I have tried, and it will continue to work on that issue myself. I made over 100 speeches across North America last year on the topic of oil sands reputation and educating people on what we do. And when they find out about things like the Wood Buffalo Environmental Association, they are impressed. I can take credit for it because one of my colleagues at Suncor and I began the Wood Buffalo Environmental Association many years ago, and we did so with a couple of primary points. Number one, we wanted to combine what was then two separate air monitoring station or networks, myself at Syncrude and him at Suncor. Number two, we wanted to make it much more inclusive and transparent. So we formed an organization. We invited stakeholders to participate. And in those days, as in the case today, all stakeholders in the region can participate, including First Nations. That is also true with the Regional Aquatic Monitoring Program. In fact, First Nations can participate in the water monitoring programs in the region. So in terms of inclusiveness, these two organizations are very inclusive. Same goes for the Cumulative Effects Management Association. First Nations have been, continue to be members. And in terms of influencing programs, that's also true. So I think it comes down to people either don't wish to learn or don't understand, in fact, what's going on there, because I cannot anywhere in North America find a trio of more broad monitoring and management organizations.
But Mr. Thompson, there is some issue, though. There is some scientific, and I think that it's in in the interest of the industry to address some of those answers. When you have some, I'm trying to understand, and that's the sake of the study. When Dr. Schindler is providing some numbers, when you have some expert who are saying that, do you believe then that if we would have a better monitoring, because there's the issue of the toxicity, but also there's issue of water, okay? And you said we can kind of address that. How would you perceive the role of the federal government, because we all know that there's already a convention between the government of Canada and the government of Alberta who's doing their own monitoring. Do you believe that we should have a better role to play, or what should we do as a government?
The federal government has been a member of the Regional Aquatic Monitoring Program since day one, has influenced its scope and its studies since day one. What we have is a paper by Dr. Schindler, which is narrow in terms of time and geography, and we have that versus 13 years, 2.5 million data points, the Regional Aquatic Monitoring Program, which is broad in terms of scope and geography. We also have 2 panels looking into it right now, and if we need to change as a result of the recommendations from those panels, we will do so.
Okay. Mr. Lepine, obviously, I wanted to ask him the question first so you would be able to react, because this is an important issue. And inclusiveness, transparency demands that the First Nation would be also part of it. Now, some of the people of the industry were doing what it takes. You don't. How would you react to that, what Mr. Thompson just mentioned?
See, like mentioning RAMP, which is a Regional Aquatics Monitoring Program, and CIMA, we were one-time members of those organizations, but we have since pulled out as ACFN. The reason being is because the results that were coming back to us were, in our opinion, inadequate, because where I come from, the elders live off the land, and they see the changes out there, and there are fish coming out of the lake, fish coming out of the river that are deformed. The animals are getting sick. The medicinal plants are getting sick. So our whole traditional way of living is becoming, pretty.
I don't have a lot of time left, but I was a bit, the issue of cancer is clearly an issue sensitive for me. Do you have any, because we're saying there's more cancer, do we have some monitoring? Do we have some numbers that prove that?
Right now, the only proof that we have, aside from RAMP, and is David Schillinger's report. And his study is to me, in my opinion, like one of the best, thorough investigation that was done. And I think that we need more of that. And right now, we can't point fingers at oil sand development or anybody else. But right now, because this happened in the last 20 years, this cancer rate going up so high in the last 20 years, that it's only obvious that it's coming from directly south of us, which is the oil sand development area.
Thank you, Mr. Lepine. Thank you, Mr. Coder. We go now to Madame. Point of order, Mr.
Chair,
Cullen.
pardon, Bob. Just for committee's sake and wanting to understand our process as committee, we've sought a number of times to have other committees televised. This being such an important and national issue affecting many millions of Canadians. Yet today, and I don't wish to cast aspersions, Chair, but I'm confused as to the process that we end up televised today when we have a former Conservative candidate and a former Conservative employee with us. But on other days, we've sought television and coverage so that Canadians can better understand our hearings, and we've seen not. What I'd like to understand for all committee members' sake is how does the process work that we end up in, and the circumstances, as you can expect, are somewhat murky for me and perhaps for other committee members and Canadians watching.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Cullen. Actually, it's very clear of the process. If any member of the committee requests a meeting to be televised, it will be, if we can find an appropriate room. And the clerk does his best on every occasion to do that. So it's that simple, really. This was actually the first meeting in this series where there's been a request to have it televised. And
it was also good fortune to have, because in this committee's meetings we've had a number of requests put in and not accepted to have television. So this was just fortune and having this room available.
Were there other requests for meetings?
I haven't had an official request.
We haven't
This
had a
particular
request.
study, but we've had previous requests before, obviously. I'm just...
Okay.
Go ahead, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Mr. Anderson.
I'm not sure why Mr. Cullen, I think we've raised this issue before. He knows full well if he asked to be on TV, we try to accommodate that. I'm not sure he's not trying to filibuster something here, so it's good to get back to our witnesses.
Shortest filibuster in parliamentary history.
You know, Mr. Cullen, please just let the clerk know if you'd like a meeting to be televised. If there's any way the clerk can get a room that will allow that, we will do it.
And as I said, Chair, and mentioned this to the clerk, casting no aspersions on his good work, of course. Just curious as to our process.
He does his best,
He
and I'm
does his
sure
very
he will try to get a room that where it can be televised if the request is there.
Thank you.
Okay, Madame Brunel, for up to 7 minutes, please.
Merci,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Lepine, good morning. I'm confused and troubled because, can you hear the interpretation? Interpretation? English interpretation, can you hear it? Can you hear the interpretation? Can
you just press the lower set of buttons to the right until you get to English?
Can you now hear the interpretation? Yes. So I'll start over. I wanted to say hello to everyone who's watching on TV, and good morning, Mr. Lepine. Now, you spoke to us about the First Nations, and I'm quite troubled about what I heard. We have heard about Mr. Schindler's research on the Athabasca River and about the impact of this research. It's been felt all the way to Quebec, I'd like you to tell us about how polluted this river is. And here's something else I'd like to know. In your opening remarks, you talked about how the rights of the First Nations have been eroded and now you can hardly use your lands. So I want to understand this further. Was there an agreement with the federal government on the use of your lands? And when does that date back to? And when you say that those rights aren't being respected, what do you mean?
Good question. Okay, now going back to 1899, we had Treaty 8, which was signed. In that treaty, it stated it gave us the right to hunt, fish, and trap. Today, it's pretty much impossible to go to areas where we went to 40 years ago. 20 years ago, there are lakes that were there that don't exist no more. In terms of contamination, there's signs along the river shores, and you can see along the shores that there's this odd foam-looking weird substance that the elders cannot describe because they haven't seen it before. The main channel that comes through the Athabasca Lake, that one too, even has a silver street that's going across there. So there are various tributaries that are going into the delta, which is the Peace Athabasca Delta, which is one of the largest deltas in the world, the freshwater deltas in the world. And there's a lot of tributaries that are going into areas which we used to go to before, which are inaccessible today, because of lack of water. Because the water intake that industry uses to extract the oil from the ground is 4 barrels of water to make 1 barrel of oil. So if you do the math, in one day, I'm pretty sure it's about 1 million barrels of water coming out of that river. And if that Athabasca River is gone, that's one of our main sources of rivers that we've used for centuries upon centuries. And I foresee that river becoming a creek. It's going to be the Athabasca Creek. So if mining continues in this rate and this fast, furious rate, I see that Athabasca River becoming, like I said, a creek, and there ain't going to be no more water to get the water from. And now they're resorting to underground streams. And those underground streams, they say that they ain't going to contaminate the underground water. But if they touch the water that's underground, it is going to affect underground water streams, which will ultimately lead into the Athabasca River again. So therefore, there are various tributaries and lakes, like I stated before, that don't exist no more. And they were there 40 years ago. 30 years ago, they were there. And today, there are some elders that could take you to places, and they'll show you where what you see now is prairie, once was a lake. You could walk across lakes that were there before at one time. And in terms of cancer, You know, like the cancer rate in Fort Chipewyan quadrupled in the last 10 years. You know, like I know in 1 month we buried 7 people due to cancers and that are so rare. And one of the cancers is so rare that the ratio is like 1 in the population of 100,000 people. Our population of Fort Chipewyan, where I live, is only 1,200 people. So explain 2 deaths in 1 year being diagnosed with this rare form of cancer. You know, like, where is it coming from? You know, like, these are questions that we've been bringing up. And the only answer that we can come up with is this this old form of mining oil out of the ground right now.
Mais comme vous n'avez plus...
Now, because you can no longer be consulted or consult, what will you do? Everyone will die. You'll no longer have access to the courts. The damage will be irreversible. So should we be suggesting something to the government? Should there be some sort of standing round table that involves First Nations and various levels of government where there is an obligation to meet and to act, especially? Because my fear is that if things continue this way, then it will take, in many, many years, nothing will be resolved.
See, in terms of the consultation process, like I stated earlier, like there is no Crown consultation. And as far as I'm concerned, as far as I know, Canada has a duty to consult with the Aboriginals, with the First Nations, prior to development, prior to the planning stages, and that doesn't happen. You know, what happens is that industry officials come to our town, come to Fort Chipewyan, and they consult with us. They tell us about their plans, they tell us about their projects, and we don't see no government officials, so we would love to sit down with the government and come up with safer ways of mining this oil. You know, and more adequate ways, which is going to ensure the safety of not only my children, but your children as well, too. You know, because all of our grandchildren that haven't even been born yet, they're going to be affected if this continues at this rate. So all we're asking is that we have adequate consultation. The process right now is, in my opinion, flawed, you know, because we haven't consulted properly with any government officials. You know, our consultation is always with industry. It's always industry people or ERCB. You know, and so at a federal government level, we would love to sit down at the table and consult with the federal government, you know, on a monthly basis if possible. Every time a project is proposed, we would love to sit down at the table with the government and consult with them. You know, like now we've got all these foreign countries, foreign investors coming in, you know, and these people don't even know who we are as Indigenous people, you know, and we would love for them to know who we are as well, too. So it's a consultation process that has to be revamped.
No?
Merci, Madame Brunel. We go now to Mr. Cullen for up to 7 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, gentlemen, for appearing today. The last thing you said, Mr. Lepine, you talked about the need for consultation. It's often, your group, your First Nation has often been described as anti-development, as just ideologically against what's happening in the tar sands. The last statement you said doesn't sound like an anti-development statement. It sounds like you want to be consulted prior to licenses being issued.
Exactly.
To hear Mr. Thompson and others from industry describe the relationships between industry, the government, and First Nations, it sounds like things are pretty good. You know, they're a big employer of First Nations, the largest in Alberta. Things are great. You guys are making some money. There may be some environmental problems, but not according to the energy industry. I guess Canadians can be forgiven for being confused, because if you hear one side of the story, it sounds like everything's just absolutely great with First Nations relations and the oil industry in northern Alberta. But then you come before us and say otherwise.
Yep. You know, like Canada, you know, always, they want to promote industry, you know, and they want to promote jobs. You know, like our community, like I said, has only 1,200 people. You know, they want to promote jobs. They want to promote oil sand development and oil. You know, but what they don't know, and what Canada seems to kind of hide, is the fact that aside from the cancer rates going on at Fort Chipewyan, you know, like I want to be able to go out in the bush and hunt. I want to be able to go out and kill a moose. And today, it's getting to the point where we have to travel farther and farther and farther away. You know, so
let me ask you this, because you said something earlier in your testimony about the cumulative impacts, so that one development project after another another, but they seem to get reviewed in isolation, as if they were existing in different parts of the world.
Exactly.
Now, this committee is trying to understand energy security, and part of energy security for Canada is also environmental security, knowing that we can keep doing this for the foreseeable future. Is your suggestion that cumulative impacts are critical to understanding the environmental component of energy security?
Very crucial.
So I want to turn that to Mr. Thompson. We've had CAP, we've had Syncrude, Suncor, many of the leading oil companies in Alberta say Canada needs an energy security plan. Is your group of that opinion, or are you contrary to that opinion?
No, in fact, if you look at it, I think one of the issues facing us as a nation is the need to ensure that all energy forms are understood and contribute to our long-term energy security. So in that regard, a strategic energy plan we would not be opposed to.
So in that vein then, and as a stream from my conversation with Mr. Lepine, there is frustration that when the government assesses these projects, when they're being proposed, there's never a consideration of the cumulative impact on the watershed. It's each project is taken in isolation. And as former Premier Lougheed said, there never was a plan and we needed a plan. Are we not repeating that history again right now? And let me be specific on one point, because I think this is an important one for Canadians, proud Canadians, as has been said, that projects are now being approved explicitly for the export of raw bitumen and pipelines to other places for processing and upgrading. Is that true?
So first of all, let me take it in order. In terms of cumulative impacts, every regulatory process that has ever gone on for as long as I can remember, going back into the 70s, required cumulative impact assessment as part of the EIA process. That is a fundamental requirement. And if you look at any environmental impact assessment or any regulatory process on any oil sands project, you will find that that is complete. Secondly, in the province of Alberta, the Lower Athabasca Regional Plan has rolled out. It is specifically a large-scale regional plan to deal with cumulative effects. And with respect to land, just as an example, if you include Wood Buffalo National Park as well as the 20% of northeast Alberta that the province of Alberta has asked for plans, it will amount to something like 40% of northeast Alberta being set aside free and clear of development. I know of not very many jurisdictions in the world that can say that.
Can you get to the aspect of, just because I want to be clear on the raw exports piece, energy security is often talked about as affordable, sustainable. The current estimates are that for every 525,000 barrels of raw bitumen that go down a pipeline, we lose somewhere in the neighborhood of 15,000 upgrading jobs and associated jobs to that industry. Does this feed Canada's energy security, this plan?
Well, Canada is an export market and an economy. The aspects of that are that we need to export bitumen because there is not sufficient market demand in Canada. There is also many facilities.
There's not. I don't think what you just said is necessarily
Mr.
the point.
Colin, if you could just let him.
No, but I think you may have misunderstood
answer.
my question, Chair. So I just want to clarify the question. We're not talking about all of the oil that's processed in Canada being used in Canada. The specific question is around sending jobs down those same pipelines, that if we previously set up the industry in such a way that the upgrading happened in Alberta particularly, when you lose those thousands of jobs, the energy security of Canada in terms of reaping the best reward we can from our endowment of resources is lessened, is it not?
I think what's happening is if you look at our market in the States, some of those large heavy oil refineries are no longer receiving supplies from Venezuela and Mexico and those heavy oil producing states. That is creating a market for Canadian heavy oil in the South, and that's what's happening. That oil is being exported to where the market demand is. There is not sufficient right now spread between the price of bitumen and the price of upgraded crude oil to justify upgraders. So, in fact, that's not exporting jobs. That's responding to market demand.
A question. You mentioned the energy outlook from the International Energy Agency in your testimony. Is that right?
Yes.
I'm wondering why you neglected to include the second piece of what the IEA suggests in that 40% increase picture, which is suggesting that governments take no action. That's the preface to what that 40% increase says. And it also implies, and this is according to the IEA, a 6-degree rise in temperature globally. That's the associated reference that you just made today. I'm hoping, I know you said it was cold today in Alberta, but I'm hoping you're not suggesting that a prediction of 6-degree rise and that the government is complicit in such a endeavor as that would be a good thing for Canada's energy security.
Well, I know that the Government of Canada has set its climate change policy, and we will be looking forward to that policy being enacted.
We all would.
And we will respond to it. But for now, our job, as I said, is to respond to market demand, produce the energy that is required both for Canada and to create economic well-being for the Canadian citizens.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. We go finally to Mr. Anderson for up to 7 minutes.
Can you let me know when I have a minute left? I'd like
Sure.
Ms. Gallant to have the last minute and a half or whatever. I'm going to go quickly through my questions, and I've got a number of them, so I may be cutting people off if I need to. Mr. Lepine, you have about 920 people in the AFCN as a registered population, I believe. I'm told that do you represent the AFCN business group?
I don't represent the ACFN.
Who would be the person that we could talk to if we wanted to bring them in to represent them? Do you know who that person would be?
Yeah, a guy named Gary Flett.
Okay,
He's
because
the
I noticed
CEO.
that the AFCN Business Group is an umbrella organization for Athabasca, Chippewa, and First Nation business ventures and employs over 1,400 people. So it seems that there's I guess, obviously another story to be told from your community as well about the employment opportunities that exist there.
Yep. Out of that 1,400, I believe there's maybe 20 to 30 members of the ACFN that work there.
And is there a reason why your own community businesses aren't employing your own people?
Because a lot of people would like to reside in Fort Chipewyan. They want to stay home, and they get pressured and forced into a point where they have no choice but to go and work down south, because what happens is the industry comes to our local schools and they go there and they encode and brainwash the children into believing and limiting their education to get a trade as a welder and or a pipe fitter, and they limit their education, So if you go to Fort Chipewyan and ask some little kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? They're going to say a welder.
Something,
I want to be a pipe fitter.
I have to take great exception to that. My son just got his journeyman carpentry, and I don't consider him to have a limited education. I think he's a young man who's shown a great initiative to be able to go out and get that, and I think most of us would probably think that way as well. So the opportunities are there. People are or may not be taking them, is what you're saying to us today.
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to ask you, Mr. Lamont brought up the issue of funding from outside. Where do you get the funding for your organization and your work? Can you tell me?
Me?
Yeah.
For my line of work, it comes directly from industry, because my job is, in fact, what he said, part of the EIA process. My job was a traditional environmental knowledge facilitator. So my job is, prior to these developments to happen, what I do is I interview elders, I talk to elders, and so it's required by industry to come up with an EIA, to come up with a traditional.
So industry is consulting with you. Then they're actually paying your wages so that they can get the information from you. Okay, Mr. Lamont, in your book, I'm wondering, do you deal with the issue of cancer rates?
Yeah, I do. John O'Connor was the doctor from Nova Scotia originally who rang the alarm bell really hard, said there were 6 cases of this rare bile duct cancer called cholangiocarcinoma. But the funny thing is, as soon as he went to the media about that, and the Alberta Health said, well, let's get to the bottom of this, the cancer board said, okay, show us your patient charts, he refused, which was sort of startling. And his chief nurse said, we've got to give those cancer reports. It's actually required under law, and he stonewalled. And so the College of Physicians and Surgeons launched an ethics investigation. These weren't politicians or bureaucrats. These were his fellow doctors. And 2 years later, Dr. O'Connor had been talking about skyrocketing cancer cases, 6 rare cancer cases, a 33-year-old dying of cancer. For 2 years, he was telling the story. Finally, when the ethics report came out by the College of Physicians and Surgeons, they ruled that he was inaccurate, that he had not provided his that he reported cases that did not exist. 4 out of these 6 cholangiocarcinomas did not exist at all. The 33-year-old who allegedly died of cancer, no one could find trace of him. But instead of punishing the doctor, the college said, well, let's put out a factual statement that we can all agree on because you've caused so much alarm in Fort Chip. Amazingly, Dr. O'Connor refused to put out a joint statement of facts with the college. Again, I'm not talking politicians or bureaucrats. I'm talking fellow doctors, issued a ruling that he had conducted himself unethically. I asked Dr. O'Connor, I saw him a couple weeks ago in Calgary, I asked him, are you going to appeal this ruling? They've said, basically, you're a liar. And he said, no, he's not going to appeal it, which I think says it all right there.
Okay, I have another question for you. You mentioned TIDES, I think it was, in terms of funding from outside. Rockefeller Foundation is one of the groups that organizes that. I think there's Stephen Rockefeller's drafted the Earth, or is one of the drafters of the Earth Charter. The document says it laments the dominant patterns of production and consumption are causing environmental devastation, the depletion of resources, and a massive extinction of species. I'm just wondering if you have any comment on that kind of funding coming from outside our country in order to, I would suggest it's anti-Canadian. What are the reasons for that?
Well, Vivian Krause, who I understand is testifying, she's done all the research on this, but $190 million from United States lobby groups is poured into Canada to affect our domestic policy. I mean, I love the Americans, but I don't want them to tell us how to write our laws. I love them as neighbors, not as bosses. And I take some, I mean, but they're not the only ones. Greenpeace, which started out as a Canadian lobby group, it's now a $250 million a year multinational corporation based in Europe. And I don't really want foreign lobbyists telling us how to make our decisions. Let's make our decisions using Canadian values. And sometimes when Americans say, oh, by the way, don't export oil to China, stay totally dependent on us for a market, is that really in our interest? I mean, who follow the money, I say. I mean, who is celebrating the slowdown of the oil sands? The Saudi ambassador.
There's more to this than just environmental issues.
Absolutely. It's an ideological agenda. It's a foreign policy agenda. And I wish that everyone from Greenpeace to the Tides Foundation to the Suzuki Foundation, which has taken $10 million from these guys, would have to register as foreign lobbyists because they're taking foreign cash.
I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Glant, but I notice, Mr. Lepine, you seem to be agreeing with Mr. Levant.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, our opposition colleagues allege that Canadian mining companies use substandard employment practices in other countries, but deem it perfectly acceptable for foreign oil companies to oppress their workers in favor of Canadian oil. Even here today, we hear the inaccurate juvenile slur, tar sands as opposed to oil sands. Mr. Levant, what's behind this contradiction? Are there outside or foreign entities influencing our legislators in some way?
I think some of it is NIMBYism. I mean, I think there's some folks who don't want to see any environmental side effects in Canada, but they don't mind if Nigeria has 2,000 toxic waste dumps. They don't mind if women are oppressed in Saudi Arabia because they don't have to see it. 230 ducks were killed when they sat down on our tailings ponds a few weeks ago. Mea culpa. That's terrible. I'm not going to call it a tragedy, though, because there really is blood oil out there, 300,000 Darfuris. Maybe if those 300,000 Darfuris were ducks, Tides Foundation would give a damn, but they don't. And you know what? I think that we should always improve in Canada. I think, frankly, I agree with some of what Mr. Cullen says about constant improvement and constant self-criticism. And I think I actually agree with Mr. Lepine on that. But what we're seeing instead of focusing on improving, this NIMBYism. I don't want people who say I would rather buy Saudi misogynist terrorist oil, rather buy Russian military dictatorship, invade Georgia oil, than have it here. And you know what? I discovered after writing the book, I didn't discover it until afterwards, is half of Canada imports its oil. We're exporting the oil in the West, but folks in the Atlantic, even in Montreal, there are tankers of OPEC oil flowing into this country. I bet you most folks in Montreal don't realize that when they turn their car, they're burning Saudi oil where women aren't allowed to vote. And I say, let's pull the camera back and think globally and act locally. If you're okay with buying conflict oil from Sudan, hey, go for it. But go ahead.
Sorry, Mr. Levant, your time is up, and unfortunately, our time is up for this panel. Thank you all very much for your presentations and for answering questions. A very informative panel. We'll suspend the committee just for 2 minutes, I hope, to change panel members, and we'll do that as quickly as possible. Mr. Lepine, you have a short comment?
I just want to ask just one question.
Sure.
I've been asked to ask you. I just want to know if this committee is going to make a strong recommendation to ensure the safety of the woodland caribou, buffalo, which are now endangered, and animals, to minimize, further destruction in that area.
After discussion amongst committee members, the report will be determined. So I can't comment on that with any certainty, but certainly the committee members have heard your plea.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We'll suspend for just a couple of minutes and come back with the second panel. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're here for our second panel, continuing our study on energy security in Canada. And we have on our second panel from the Alberta Innovates Technology Futures, Ian Potter, Chief Operating Officer. Welcome. We have as an individual, Vivian Krause, welcome. And we have from HTC Pure Energy Incorporated, Jesse Inman, Executive Director, Corporate Development, welcome. We will have the presentations in the order that you are listed on the agenda. So we'll start with Ian Potter from the Alberta Innovates Technology Futures. Go ahead for up to 7 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be here today on behalf of Alberta Innovates Technology Futures. I should, for those of you who are familiar to Alberta, that's the now company that was the original Alberta Research Council. We did restructure on January the 1st, in 2010 this year, part of the provincial restructuring of the innovation system. So in looking at the questions that were posed for the committee, it's, as you are aware, a wide-ranging area and very complex, as the previous session obviously got into. To my mind, I I'm a simple guy sometimes. My wife says I'm a simple guy. So I like to bring it back to simplicities. The question of energy security is wide-ranging. Even its definition can be challenging. You'll find numerous definitions. I'm sure you've heard several during the context of this. But simply put, the average Canadian wants electricity when they flick a switch, hot water when they turn on the water faucet, gasoline when they go to the gas station. Quite simple. Unfortunately, it's all at a reasonable price. Whatever that means nowadays is a bit of a moving target, and of course environmentally sound. But as long as it doesn't cost any more to do that. The reality of energy security for Canada is very complex. We are both an importer and, as was alluded to earlier, an exporter of energy in all its forms, whether it's a raw material such as oil, coal, uranium, but also we have electricity and energy vector that we actually communicate with the US and across borders of the provincial territories. We also, as has also been said, we live in a huge, sparsely populated country with amazing extremes of temperatures, where investment and infrastructure required to exploit and provide energy to Canadians was historically one of the most ambitious and complex engineering endeavours of all time. In my opinion, we were very lucky to have those people in the 19th and 20th century that actually challenged that and had the energy, internal energy, to do that. But if I look at energy security in a wider manner, and I agree with the recent 2009-10 capstone seminar student report from the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs from the University of Ottawa, that there are 8 independent factors which together constitute Canadian energy security. Diversity of Canada's energy mix, the level of market transparency, investment, free market nature of the Canadian energy sector, energy infrastructure, energy intensity, environmental considerations, and lastly, geopolitics. But in my opinion, there are other more complex issues that muddy the waters of energy security and the role that governments, including federal and provincial, need to recognise and execute upon. These include, firstly, risk management. Our roles as government is to manage the risk, understand the risks. We may not know the issue to the nth degree, but we can manage the uncertainty and mitigate the risks as a continuous process. Secondly, sovereignty. Where we're lauding it, we may be trying to temper our discussions. One example I'll give you at the moment, which is fairly topical, is the Arctic and our sovereignty issues in the Arctic territories. Whose is it? Where does it belong? Where's the dividing line? Thirdly, and this is my belief, if we need to assert, we need to assert world leadership in energy and environmental stewardship. Are we an energy superpower or just a commodity trader? How can we be acknowledged as such? And who should acknowledge that energy superpower rather than just maybe claiming it? Fourthly, the cause-effect challenge. In many cases, the energy development around the world is huge. The environmental consequences are also huge. But there are other challenges that seek to the heart of the social and economic well-being of communities. And lastly, innovation. The yet unmet desire that all the preceding issues will be managed and understood if only, I say if only, we could innovate in areas such as technology development, policy frameworks, and areas such as health management. In my opinion, innovation strategy and the policy is central to energy security. The recent work by the Canadian Council of Chief Executives is one example of possible options to move forward the innovation agenda. I noticed there's another conference just around the corner here on innovation today. But previous innovation agendas have failed. I remember a previous government, about 2002, I believe it was, in Vancouver, when Howard Dhaliwal was the Minister of Natural Resources. I remember saying, we need Canadians to innovate. And there's a discussion going on in the room, but there's a translation gap going on there. Government is innovating, industry is innovating, but how do we actually get them innovating together? But why did we fail? Firstly, I think the science and technology agendas that have been enacted haven't really understood and embedded the longer-term thinking that innovation requires. Secondly, I don't think we're asking the right questions. What is innovation? What are we trying to do with innovation? Is it environmental? Is it economic? What is it? How are we trying to get a grip of this major area? And the third area, perhaps the most important, as with any strategic agenda, is the leadership, or lack thereof. We need a champion to move this agenda forward. It won't happen overnight, and probably not within a couple of electoral periods. But we need the long-term commitment to make sure that an innovation agenda feeding into an energy security agenda can be acted upon. In Alberta, many of the recent recommendations from the CCCE, such as nurturing startup companies, improving business-academic links, building talent pools of highly qualified personnel, reshaping policy frameworks and developing newly formed companies, are actually happening. My new company name is as a result of that restructuring of the innovation system. Myself and 3 sister organizations around health, bioindustries, and energy. On the federal side of innovation, the ability to focus the agenda is paramount. But complex agendas may be limiting the ability for federal policy development to learn from the science and technology agendas and move forward in support of the energy security challenge. We need to ask the basic questions. What needs to be done? Who needs to do it? When does it need to be done? And what resources do they need to execute? And how do we keep them accountable? The natural long cycle innovation, although complex, needs to feed from the universities and groups such as the National Research Council, where the big science can happen under a national focus, but collaborate in a regional framework by linking with the various provincial research entities such as the New Brunswick Research and Productivity Centre, Saskatchewan Research Council, Manitoba Industrial Technology Centre, CRIC in Quebec, and my own group, the Alberta Innovates Technology Futures, where we understand the jurisdictional advantage for energy and the environment, and we can directly support company to drive the economy, but also understanding and support the well-being of all Canadians in our own provincial areas. I'm an optimist, and I firmly believe that the challenges that our forefathers overcame in the early days of Canada's energy growth are the strength and resolve that we need to move forward in today's challenges, but turning them into tomorrow's opportunities. Canada's energy resources are central to development as a country, but with these resources come responsibilities. Governments in Canada must apply good management and leadership to develop policy and fiscal frameworks to assess when, or if, these resources should be accessed and under what terms. In my opinion, the regulatory system in Canada is robust, appropriate and accountable, but it can be improved. We should always look to improve our systems, always questioning whether we're doing the right thing for the right reasons and improving all the time. With the above said, I believe that government's fundamental role in energy security is leadership on the provincial, national and international stage. That doesn't mean always being at the front, but it does mean understanding the risks, managing them, nurturing where needed with fiscal and policy support, effectively communicating with stakeholders to understand their concerns rather than just transmitting at them, advancing future policy development based on sound science and engineering, knowing when to pass on that leadership, showing innovation to catalyse future action, and good management. But above all, as we hold politicians accountable by our votes, you need to hold us accountable as industry and research groups to be accountable for our actions and our inactions. Thank you once again, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity to appear. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Potter from Alberta Innovates Technology Futures. We now go to the second presentation. Vivian Krause, here is an individual. Go ahead, please, for up to 7 minutes.
Thank you. Are we on? I'm a resident of North Vancouver. I have a Master's of Science degree in nutrition, and I worked most of my years with the United Nations Children's Fund, 6 years in Guatemala and 5 in Indonesia. For the sake of time, I won't go into how I went from UNICEF to salmon farming to doing an extensive review of more than 6,000 pages of U.S. tax returns for charitable foundations which are funding the campaign against Alberta Oil. But I would like to say from the outset that I am not funded by anyone. I am not part of any industry or any political party. I would also like to acknowledge the much appreciated contributions of my colleague Rob Skagel. I'd like to focus my remarks on what I see as the foreign funding from American charitable foundations behind what I would call the demarketing of Alberta oil. Demarketing is reducing demand or shifting demand away. We don't hear much about demarketing because most of marketing is about selling more, not selling less. But when it comes to Alberta oil, demarketing is precisely what Canadian environmental organizations have been paid to do by American charitable foundations. And Alberta oil isn't the only or the first important Canadian export that has been demarketed by million-dollar American-funded campaigns. The same thing has been done with Canadian forest products and farmed salmon. If everything that is said negatively about Alberta oil is true, I would agree it should be demarketed. But as we heard in the previous session, some of what is said is flagrantly untrue. So I believe the question that needs to be asked is there a sound scientific basis? Is there a sound case for the demarketing of Alberta oil? And if not, then why is it being done? According to my analysis of U.S. tax returns, American charitable foundations have granted at least $18 million specifically for demarketing Alberta oil and thwarting the Canadian oil and gas industry. By the way, that figure is up by about $3 million from the $15 million that I reported in an op-ed in the Financial Post in October. Some grants were specifically to thwart the Canadian oil and gas industry. For example, in 2006, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund paid $200,000 to the Pembina Foundation and to the West Coast Environmental Law Research Foundation for, amongst other things, and I quote, to prevent the development of a pipeline and tanker port. In 2009, the Bullitt Foundation paid the Tides Foundation to get the Dogwood Initiative to, and I quote, expand outreach campaign to mobilize urban voters for a federal ban on coastal tankers. And the Brainerd Foundation, another American foundation, paid the Dogwood Initiative to, and I quote, help grow public opposition to counter the Enbridge pipeline. They're doing what they're paid to do. The Rockefeller Brothers Fund granted at least $105,000 specifically to the First Nations that are right at the mouth of the Douglas Channel, which is right where oil tankers would need to load if they were export bound for Asia. That included $70,000 for an anniversary celebration in 2004 and $35,000 for a ceremonial event in 2006. Now, of all the Aboriginal people in the world and of all the places in the world, why does the Rockefeller Brothers Fund choose to pay more than $100,000 to the First Nations at the Kitimat village, right at the mouth of the Douglas Channel? I can see how what they are doing is protecting the environment. I can also see how what they are doing is protectionism in the name of the environment. I believe that it's important to look at the campaign against Alberta oil within the broader context of initiatives that foreign American foundations have funded in our country. According to my analysis and preliminary calculations, over the past 10 years, American foundations have spent approximately $300 million on conservation initiatives in Canada and the so-called reform of our resource-based industries, forestry, mining, aquaculture, and oil and gas. About $50 million of that went straight to First Nations, especially on the coast of British Columbia. That included, for example, one grant for $27.3 million in a single grant. Roughly 80% of that $209 million comes from 5 foundations: Hewlett Packard, the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trusts, and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. These are the foundations that I've referred to as the Big Five. They have $22 billion in assets. They give away $1.2 billion every year. Their CEOs earn $600 to $7,100 a year. Their senior environmental staff are paid in the $300,000 range. Some of these professional environmentalists are paid more than the Prime Minister of our country. In my remaining time, I would like to share with you the 3 most important conclusions that I draw from my research and analysis. Firstly, no doubt about it, environmentalists care profoundly about the environment, but there's more to it than that. Some of the same foundations that are funding the demarketing of Alberta oil have made grants that specifically mention reduction in the dependence on fossil fuels as a matter of national security. So obviously, this isn't purely about the environment. There are other interests. Over roughly the same period that the Hewlett Foundation and the Packard Foundation, 2 separate foundations, have granted $83 million for environmental initiatives in Canada, they have also paid more than $500 million to the Climate Works Foundation and the Energy Foundation. Now, the Energy Foundation has a clear agenda to, and I quote, create a robust solar market. Since 2009, the Energy Foundation has made at least 33 grants to reduce market barriers to solar development, support utility-scale solar power, to design solar policy, to support regulatory interventions for long-term transmission corridor planning, and solar finance models. Growing the solar business takes more than sunshine. It also requires shifting investment capital away from competing industries, especially oil. Sunshine may be infinite, but capital isn't, and scaring consumers, voters, and investors, which is what campaigns do, is a way of swaying investors and their capital. So the Hewlett Foundation funds the Energy Foundation to create a robust solar market and thwart the coal industry, at the same time that the Hewlett funds the Tides Foundation and Tides Canada to demarket Alberta oil and thwart the Canadian oil and gas industry. So as I see it, the demarketing of Alberta oil is part and parcel of Hewlett's huge, heavily funded initiative to shift the energy market away from fossil fuels and towards renewables. The problem with demarketing is that you paint yourself into a corner. Because if you've positioned your products and services as being a function of better than the competition, which is bad, then if all of a sudden you start changing what you're saying about the competition, in the marketplace that changes not only what the market thinks about the competition, it changes what they say about you. So you have to stick to your positioning. And that's where you're painted in a corner, because even if your competitors reform and improve, you're stuck with depositioning and demarketing them, which is what we're seeing. My second point is that environmental activism isn't what it used to be. The new factor is money, millions and millions of it. As long as environmental organizations are paid to run multi-million-dollar campaigns, I think it's unreasonable to hope that they won't. My last point is a suggestion. Considering that American foundations have spent upwards of $300 million in our country, especially, $120 million on the Great Bear Rainforest Initiative and the Boreal Forest Initiative, I think it's pretty clear that they're serious about what they're doing. So my hope is that the leadership of government and industry will speak directly with the CEOs of these foundations. The development of Alberta oil is a billion-dollar opportunity, and I hope that we will make the most of that opportunity, minimizing the risks to a level that Canadians can accept. Both at home and abroad, we could do a lot of good with that, and in terms of the energy security, and my hope is that we will. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ms. Krause, for your presentation. We go finally to Jesse Inman, who is Executive Director, Corporate Development from HTC Pure Energy Incorporated. Thank you very much for being here, and if you could go ahead with your presentation for up to 7 minutes.
Honourable members of the Natural Resources Committee of the House and Commons, Mr. Chair Leon Benoit, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I submitted a paper to you before coming into this session, and it is too long to read in 7 minutes, so I'm going to pick out the highlights from that paper, but hopefully you will have a chance to read it later on. The people of Canada are very blessed. We're endowed with such a vast natural resource base, and we have a relatively small population in such a very large landmass. We use 2.3 billion barrels of oil equivalent per year at this point in time, and that will grow by 34 million barrels of oil equivalent by 2025, taking us to 2.9 billion barrels of oil that we will need in equivalency by 2025. So we have this incredible standard of living because we are such a blessed nation. And we have that because we have the resource for ourselves and we have sufficient resources to export to our neighbors. So Canada is a very blessed country. But this doesn't mean that we can sit back on our laurels and just say this is fine, we have a very, very rosy future in front of us. We can't do that. We have to do exactly what this committee is doing right now, and that is trying to understand and plan and manage a reasonable and sustainable mix in our energy supply for the future. Currently, we're using approximately 30% from oil, 27% from natural gas, approximately 8% from coal, 6.5% from nuclear, and 28% from hydroelectricity. So you can see from those numbers that 65% of our energy is coming from fossil fuels. And the fact of the matter is, to make that sustainable, we do have to increase our renewable resources. We're very blessed with the hydroelectricity that we have, but we do have minimum ability to increase that hydroelectricity. We're working very hard on our solar, but we only have 120 megawatts of installed solar power at this point in time. And even wind, which we're working very hard on, we have 3,320 megawatts of wind. That is only 0.2% of our energy requirements in the country. It is very, very small. And then we also have ethanol as an alternative at 5.8 million barrels of oil, which is 0.27%. So if you take the total wind, solar, and ethanol, and you said that you were going to just supply the increase in demand from now until 2025, you would have to increase that at 300% every year until 2025. So that's an incredible investment in renewable energies that we have to make in this country. So clearly we need to do something about fossil fuels as we go along that path towards a renewable society. And I think that to look at unconventional sources of supply is very important. Obviously, we have the coal bed methane, which is unconventional, and we all heard about the shale storm that has taken this continent, and we're very much looking at the fact that we have 160 barrels of oil, and approximately 20% of that will be recoverable. And there's all kinds of issues that we're dealing with in order to make that happen with new fracking and other methods of exploiting that resource. But what I'm here today to talk about is what I believe is this incredible opportunity we have in this country to have energy security at the same time as environmental security. That we can use our unconventional resource called carbon dioxide to increase our energy production. I believe that we have this asset called carbon dioxide that we're emitting to the atmosphere for absolutely no reason. And it is destroying our image. It is giving us a dirty oil image that I agree, don't deserve, but unfortunately we already have it. But it's easily solved by collecting that CO2 off of the oil sands in particular. That's what my strategy is for Alberta, is to take the CO2 from the SAGD boilers and use that for increased production, enhanced oil recovery production from conventional and heavy oil in central and south Saskatchewan and Alberta. We have 170 billion barrels of oil in the oil sands. It will be produced, as everybody has said around this table today. We all agree it's going to be produced. We're going to be emitting by 2025 more than 60 million tons of CO2 from that, all of that production. So why would we let that asset go into the atmosphere when it can be used? And we all know that 80% of the oil sands is in situ production. It's not open pit mining, and that in situ production requires steam to be injected into one of the horizontal wells, and it's once through steam generators that we use in order to make that steam. And those generators produce CO2. Those are the emissions that I'm talking about. So why not use that carbon dioxide for unconventional production, which I call enhanced oil recovery? Or some people in the industry, we call it miscible or immiscible flood. Simply what you're doing is changing the viscosity of the oil so that it will swell and you can recover it. And in conventional oil in Alberta, the estimates are that we could increase our production by 3.5 billion barrels of oil. Now, on page 3 of the paper that I gave you, I must tell you that I put an M instead of a B. And in this industry, you always have to make sure that you get your M's and your B's straight because it's quite a different number. So it's 3.5 billion additional barrels by using that asset that we're letting go into the atmosphere called carbon dioxide. Why would we do that? It doesn't make sense. We need to collect it and use it. And the same applies to the heavy oil that we have in central Alberta, and in particular in Saskatchewan. There's another 1 billion barrels of oil that we can produce using carbon dioxide by injecting it into those oil fields. So we have a unique opportunity. And one of the things that I would like to bring to the attention of the committee, and I've done that, okay, I'll keep to my 7 minutes, is the fact that we have a center of excellence on carbon dioxide in Regina. This is one of the few centers of excellence in the world. I think it's something we need to be very proud of. And using the technology, our company uses that technology. It can be exploited in Saskatchewan, in Alberta, to collect the CO2 from these once-through steam generators and take out this additional oil that Canada can use for our own security. We need to do the renewables. We need to increase our nuclear capabilities. I agree with that, but there is absolutely no reason that we cannot have clean fossil fuel production. And that can be done by taking the CO2 from the oil sands. It has high impact on the prosperity for Canada, And I would like to invite the members of this committee to come out to Regina and to look at this center of excellence that we have on carbon dioxide and how we can make it a real win-win for Canada on all levels. Thank you very much for your opportunity to be here today. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Inman from HTC Pure Energy Incorporated. We'll go directly to questions for up to 7 minutes. Mr. Tonks, go ahead, please.
Well, I hardly know where to start. This committee has been infinitely educated by the quality of witnesses that we have, and I think that is certainly no exception. We've had great presentations today. And Mr. Potter, I have to say, you're far from a simple guy. If I was as simple as that, I wouldn't have any trouble going home and saying it. But you've outlined what is the strategic interconnectedness with respect to what you talk about is taking tomorrow's opportunities from today's challenges. You talk about working with the National Research Council and the provincial affiliates to have a jurisdictional strategic policy development entity, I guess, or regime. And you've heard Ms. Krause, who has sort of described what I am inferring, and this is my inference, is a conspiracy theory here, that in some way suggests that we are not capable of dealing with balanced criticisms that are funded by legitimate entities, and that this conspiracy is in fact going to take us further from what you, Mr. Potter, have described as an opportunity. You've given us a clinical analysis and a prognosis for action. Now, my question is of you, Mr. Potter. You've heard Ms. Inman, who's also talked about the technology of developing CO2 and using it to come to grips technologically with the issues that are affecting health and creating concerns for Canadians. So my question is, I'm going to give you the floor now. What is your take, and are you still optimistic with respect to the capacity building that is needed to generate the solutions that have been addressed by others?
Well, thank you for the question. Again, I'll try and keep my answer short.
Shorter than the question.
Just quick background on me. I left home when I was 16 and joined the merchant fleet with Shell Oil before joining the Royal Navy as a marine engineering officer and then going into academia and getting my doctorate in mechanical engineering focused on power systems and submarine design. So submarine design in the prairies is pretty unique unless you live in West Edmonton Mall. But for the last 10 years, I've focused my efforts on climate change. I was the first manager of the climate change group at the Alberta Research Council. I moved into sustainable development more broadly, dealing with things like reclamation, soil amendments, manure to energy. And for the last 5 years, I was the vice president of primarily the hydrocarbon group before taking my existing job as chief operating officer. I've been involved with every roadmap I think Canada has ever done in the last 10 years on hydrogen, oil sands, oil, renewables. The ability for Canadians to catalyze around a roadmap is amazing. The ability to move beyond that roadmap to action plans lacks that leadership. I believe there's a thirst for doing something. I believe there's a thirst, the entrepreneurialism in Canadians, the yearning to do the right thing for the right reasons. So I believe there's a huge momentum underlying that is waiting to come out to address these issues. Is one technology going to be the silver bullet? No. We've got such a diverse country, such a diverse environment, such diverse energy sources. You're going to need a whole suite of technologies. They need to go through the various sequences of development from lab to company to field implementation, pilots, demonstration at a scale that I reduce the investment risk. Investment risk is the critical thing here, and having a policy framework that supports that policy, that investment risk is critical. So there's a lot of connectivity here, but I believe underneath it, Canadians like the challenge. I like the challenge. It's what actually drives me to actually go to work today.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Potter. My question is of Ms. Krause, and I hope you don't take exception to the notion of conspiracy, because in your paper you also point out that those organizations and foundations are also investing in what has been considered as part of the strategic reaction with concerns on fossil fuels, and that's solar and wind and tidal and so on. Those same organizations are investing in it. And so does that not ameliorate somewhat your thesis that there is such a huge balance towards the oil sands that it is in fact it is mitigating against the overall economic and sustainable development objectives of that has in the past driven Canadian policy in the environment, recognizing that there are huge issues on the tailing ponds and the use of water and the leaching into the aquifer and all of those things. But given what you have heard and you have experienced with so many different organizations that are attempting to be part of that sustainable development equation, many variables in that equation, does it not ameliorate somewhat your thesis that rather than a conspiracy, it's a search for balance and it's a very democratic and objective-driven pursuit, that activists and all have a role to play?
You have about a minute to answer that, Ms. Krause. Go ahead.
I agree that activists have a role to play. They keep government and industry on their toes, and rightly so. I have more than a decade of working in the United Nations and funding activists, and been one myself. I think, though, that on all sides of the equation, government, industry, and also in activism, the ethics are really important. And we need activism that's grounded in transparency and in truthfulness. And sometimes I think we need to say that when criticisms are levied against our industries, and when they're fair and when they're true, then we need to say so. And we also need to say so when things are said that are untrue. I don't think issues should be raised that are fronts for other issues. And in this particular case, I think what we're seeing is there are multiple issues. There are more than one interest at play here. So it's very simple to raise a wild salmon as a concern, or to raise environmental issues as a concern. But we need to realize that there's more to it than that. I think we need to think outside of the port too, and think of the global ramifications. I think that banning exports in the name of marine conservation is not going to go unnoticed. And I think if it's about marine conservation, then there are many places in the world where money could be spent. And I guess it raises questions for me that hundreds of millions of dollars are being spent here, and far, far less is being spent in other parts of the world.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Tonks. We go now to the Bloc Québécois. Monsieur Pomerleau, for up to 7 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of you for coming today. I agree with my colleague that today we've heard excellent testimony from various sectors, so thank you for that. Mr. Potter, you pointed out that the time has come to put some good questions with respect to innovation, and I actually like the title of the organization you represent, Innovates Technology Futures. We really are in an era of innovation now. Now, you spoke about the long term. You said that we have to stop thinking in terms of the next election. We have to think over the course of many elections. And you've said that we need to think about energy security. There's been much talk about oil in many ways, and of course that's logical. That's what we're looking at. But there are other sources of energy: solar, tidal, geothermal, which is used in Iceland, for example, solar energy. I went to Gibraltar and I saw fields of solar panels that are used to power homes. So there are many sources of energy. Is it not your feeling that beyond oil, there's a lot of research being done into other forms of energy that could be used, like CO2, for example.
I'm in Alberta. I obviously work in oil sands. I work in oil, but I do a lot of work in renewables. I think, to me, it's not about necessarily the source. I need an end product. I need electricity. I need something to run my car. Where do I get it from? Where am I? So I'm a fan of investing in all forms, depending on where you are and what you actually need. I think wind is a very good source. I think there are some limitations with regard to when the wind blows and where the wind actually is strong for example, in the province of Alberta. It's down in the southwest. So it's not practical to have long grid transmission losses to actually get the wind energy up to the oil sands, for example, because it fluctuates. There's problems with the grid and the way that the grid is managed and the harmonics that's injected into the grid. But if I look at Canada as a whole, I can't think of one energy form that we don't have that can't be used effectively. So I agree, and I look at the International Energy Agency statistics on energy investment by the governments of Canada, federal and provincial, and I look at how that's morphed during the years over the last 30-odd years, and you can see swings. Different groups have different reasons for saying we're going to put bioenergy as a topic today, and oil as a topic for tomorrow, and you can see the swings, and nuclear is there as well. My only concern is that we don't do what I would call flavor of the month research. That research is a long-term agenda normally. If I take cradle to grave from an idea in a university to effective field, if you want implementation in oil sands, 15 years. You need that long-term agenda. If I switch it on and off every 3 years, I'll never get to the actual mission and the actual end prize of actually doing it. So you do need consistency. So I come back to the provincial groups, I come back to groups such as the National Research Council that can weather the different regimes within the governments and actually do the right things in a long-term sustainable manner. But I'm an advocate of all forms of energy for the right reasons. In the right areas.
Dans la même veine, Madame Krauss.
Along Ms. Krauss's lines of thinking, there are some things that I have difficulty in understanding. The Americans need our oil, and there are American companies that are investing here, and there are Americans that dismiss or criticize the use of that oil for other reasons. I think they have a right to do that. You said these people end up painting themselves in a corner. But do you not think that if the oil companies are putting considerable risk capital into improving their technology and in doing technology and finding new processes, at some point in time there will be so much money invested in this that they themselves will have painted themselves into a corner and they won't be able to consider other forms of energy? And governments are involved in this. Everyone gets painted into a corner and they can't get out of that corner. Well, I agree. I absolutely agree. If I understand you, the industry is getting better. That's what we want. But the activism continues. Now, if there are good reasons to demarket oil, then fine. But if there is not a good reason to do that, then you have to stop. Yes, but that's your opinion. I mean, you go places to condemn activities that you don't agree with, and that's fine. Yes, I'm raising the issue, and I'm trying to identify some key questions. The question here is there a good reason? Are there grounds to demarket? Is there a scientific basis to demarket our oil? And if so, well, then we need to change and improve the industry. But if there is not a good reason, then one has to ask themselves questions. So I do agree that one has to get at the truth. And I'm not the one person who can answer that question. I don't think any one person can. This is a question of science and technical expertise. But those are the questions that have to be asked. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Pomerleau.
Mr. Cullen, for up to 7 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you to our witnesses. Just first, Ms. Inman, trying to understand energy security, one of the questions that we raise is what is the role of the federal government? And saying those words sometimes in Alberta can get you into a lot of trouble. What is the role of the federal government with respect to energy? And there's a certain constituency that gets really nervous. Yet we've been hearing consistently from oil companies, many of them based in Alberta, saying we need the federal government to play a role, and some suggest a stronger role around the question of energy security. Your group and the industry that you represent is around the capture of carbon, the sequestration. Is the lack of a carbon price a factor in the decisions that get made in your specific industry? That Canada has no carbon price that we know of right now. We're sort of waiting on Congress, is what the current minister tells us, U.S. Congress. What's the uncertainty result in your industry?
The lack of a carbon price is the number one reason that we're not capturing carbon dioxide right now. Yes, absolutely. In Alberta, we have a price of $15 a ton, but this doesn't go anywhere near incentivizing companies to capture the CO2. And
the role of the federal and provincial government when incentivizing the early days in northern Alberta and the tar sands was complete. There was tax incentives. There was all sorts of industry groups set up with government to enable that industry to exist, because up until that point it was just too expensive to get bitumen to oil. That was a technological barrier. Mr. Potter, is that true? And so the role of the federal government and energy at that moment for Alberta was, I would suggest, significant in enabling the creation of the industry that exists today. Is that correct, Mr. Potter? And then I'll come back to
Yeah, just to comment on that I think is really important in terms of if we go back even further than that and we look at the role the federal government played when we put in the infrastructure for the existing oil and gas industry in Alberta. That was put in by the federal government. And I purport that why shouldn't the federal government help us put in some of the infrastructure that's required to take that carbon dioxide and move it about?
I follow you to a point, though, on that argument, in the sense that oil's $90 again a barrel today. The price point, even with carbon capture, the Canadian public's going to wonder, why would that cost not just be internalized? And I go back to my point about pricing carbon. Shell has already started to price carbon internally. They've said we're going to put a $40 a ton price into our future plans. But why should the public have to pick up the cost of capturing that carbon on behalf of oil companies, which by all intents and purposes are doing very well right now and have been for some time?
Well, from my perspective, I don't think that our company is asking for the government to make a long-term commitment to subsidizing the capture of carbon dioxide. But there is a gap at the moment, even if we are using that CO2 for enhanced oil recovery. There's a dollar gap between the cost of capture and getting it to those enhanced oil recovery production. Because enhanced recovery is not just straightforward. Not every reservoir is perfect for recovery. So it's a hit-and-miss game.
And expensive in the early days.
It's very, very expensive in the early days.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut you off just because I'm going to run out of time. I don't want to get Mr. Inman for a second. Mr. Inman, in April this year, this federal government resisted Sinopec's offer to buy into the tar sands, particularly on the export of raw bitumen to a lower level region for refinement, because the Prime Minister had made a commitment in 2006 and then again in 2008 not to export raw bitumen to jurisdictions that had lower environmental standards than our own. You talked about free market and geopolitics being two factors in an energy security environment. Is what the Prime Minister did in line with free market principles to resist a free market offer to buy up a big chunk of Sinopec? Or Sinopec to come in and buy up a big chunk in the oil sands?
I'm not a market expert, so I'll probably won't get into hot water by trying to answer the question directly.
It's an interesting moment, though,
It is a very...
Sinopec wants to buy ConocoPhillips. Some billions of dollars of so-called foreign investment are on the table, and the government says no.
No,
the government says because of your lower standards in China in particular for upgrading on GHG emissions.
And that is a very strong geopolitical reality.
The
question is, but that's why you have the expertise in the other groups, not in my person, to actually advise you accordingly.
So
I will advise you on the technology and on the research needs for it, but the market side of it is beyond my resume, if you want to be simplistic.
Then it comes back to what this committee is trying to study, which is around the notions of energy security. Because if I'm in the oil sector, that puts an element of uncertainty to me in terms of who I'm available to be sold to and who I'm not, depending on where they come from. Yes. This was a Chinese endeavor. If it had been German or French or Australian, maybe the sale would have gone ahead. We don't know. And again, back to the role of federal government. Well, Mr. Krause, I want to turn to you for a second. If I can get, and I've looked at your article in the Post, which I think you've had to take some down, but in terms of the connections of Tides Canada and Tides the U.S., perhaps not. Your thesis is outside influence, essentially, outside money coming in and affecting Canadian policy and Canadian lives. Is that right? Is that the concern that you raise in the article that I'm reading?
My concern is that there's a mix of interests. It's not purely about the environment. I can see that what they're doing would protect the environment, but I can also see that other purposes and other jobs.
But the notion of the money coming from the U.S. as opposed to, if the money had been raised in Toronto or Calgary or Vancouver to fight that same fight, your concerns would be less. In your article, again and again, you talk about how the money is, you very much do. These are your own words. The question I have is this. There's a proposal happening right now with the Enbridge pipeline, which I'm sure all the witnesses are familiar with. Enbridge has told me and told the public that they've raised $100 million, $10 million from 10 different companies to promote their project. Some of those companies are foreign, right? And they are buying influence if they can. They are paying for things in Kitimat Village, which you mentioned earlier. They're paying for festivities, and they're paying for new skateboard parks, and they're spending money, which is of foreign origin, to affect Canadians' hearts and minds. Why haven't you investigated that?
Let me be very clear. I think charities should be doing charity, and I would be just as disappointed if Canadian charitable foundations were funding something that wasn't exclusively charitable. It just so happens that the charitable foundations that are funding this are American, and I would be calling them out if they were, no matter what country they were from.
Are they not Canadian as well?
Including if they were from our own. Yes, there is some charitable funding, but very, very little compared to what is coming in from others.
So you have no concern about Enbridge?
You're out of time, Mr. Cullen.
That's fascinating. The question the answer, Chair, was that Enbridge has raised similar millions, tens of millions of dollars.
She may choose to answer it when she's responding to questions from Mr. Allen, who is next.
Thank you, Mr.
Go ahead,
Chair,
please, Mr. Allen.
Thank you for our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Inman, I'd like to start with you and pick up on one of the comments that Mr. Collins started, was building $40 per ton into the pricing, and then you talked about the $15 per ton in Alberta. I guess what would that impact be? Because we all know that it's going to be transferred to the consumer. What would be the impact of that consumer, and have you got any estimates on what that price per ton is?
The gap at the moment between the cost of capture, the cost of transportation, and the cost of injecting that into a reservoir that may have incremental oil production, I believe the cost is somewhere between $70 and $100. Right at the moment, the tax in Alberta is $15 a ton, so that's not going to get us anywhere close to covering those costs. And when I talk to the enhanced oil recovery producers, they're saying, well, maybe a price of $40 a ton is something we would like to pay. So you can see there's a very large gap. And that's why, to get this industry kick-started, we need some help from the government to get our technology, which I believe is completely proven technology at this very small scale, we need to get it into the commercial realm, and we would like that kick-started with the government's assistance. Does that answer your question?
It does, but so either way, we're going to create in my view, a false market.
Not over time.
Subsidizing. The government isn't subsidizing, or the consumers are going to pay in the end result.
But just in the beginning. But if you take that out over, and I don't have those exact numbers with me, Mr. Allen, but I can get them for you. But if you take that out over the vast number of consumers there are across the country, it's a very, very small increment in the terms of the cost of our energy that we use every day in our homes and in our cars. It's much, much smaller than we think that it is. And recently, gasoline prices, just in the last few years, they tripled. Did anybody stop driving their cars? No, they didn't. So I don't think that in the end the consumer is going to be vastly affected by the cost to capture our carbon, but we do need the government to get on board with this so that we can get it started.
Okay.
But in the end, the consumers will be willing to pay for it.
Okay, well, I might debate that with you, but Ms. Krause, going to you with respect to one of the comments you made is activism is not what it used to be. I would say so. I mean, I'm looking at some of the chief investment officer salaries here in one of the slides, $1.6 million, $1.5 million a year, and CEO salaries, pretty significant dollars, almost like the major banks. Can you tell me, you said $300 million over the last 10 years in some of the research that you've done. You also commented that was on three things, though. It was oil and gas, it was forestry, and that type of thing. And then you said this year's 15, it's gone from $15 to $18 million just to lobby efforts on oil and gas. Has that been a decreasing amount over this 10 years, or have you seen the oil and gas ramp up? Are you seeing an acceleration in those amounts in the last 10 years or the last even 2 or 3 years?
Oh, huge increase, yes. Let's see. I'll just give you an example with one foundation. The first comment I wanted to make was the main reason that I say that environmental activism isn't what it used to be is because if you look back over the last 10 years, in the late 90s, the average grant might have been $50,000. You saw lots of grants for $10,000 or $12,000 or even less than $10,000. By the mid-90s, you're seeing $500,000 grants are not at all unusual. And now it's not at all unusual to see $1 million or multi-million-dollar grants in a single grant. So we've gone from 5 digits to 6 digits to 7-digit grants. That's what I see. The assets, for instance, one foundation, the Tides Canada Foundation, in 2001 had assets of $1 million. Now they have assets of $33 million. So how do they go from $1 million in assets to $33 million? You can do quite a bit with the earnings off of $33 million. Just to give you an example from the Hewlett Foundation, in 2004 they paid Tides Canada $70,000 to develop, and I quote, a strategic plan to address oil and gas development in British Columbia. I'd like to know what was that strategic plan. And since then, in the last 4 years, the next year they granted, so after $70,000 in 2004, then $250,000, then $1.5 million in 2007. The next year, from $1.5 to $3 million, and then the last 2 years, $2 million, and now this year $2.4 million. So yes, we have seen a very, very steep increase in the funding.
Can you comment on one of your slides that says, it's the one that says US $56 million paid to Tides Canada. Since 2003, when Tides Canada got equivalency status in the US, Tides Canada can re-grant US funds in the name of Tides. How does that process work on that re-granting?
Well, my understanding, to the best of my knowledge, is that Tides Canada has essentially 2 entities. And so in Canada, there are 2 registered charities. One is called the Tides Canada Foundation, and one is called the Tides Canada Initiative Society. Now, Tides Canada Foundation has equivalency status in the U.S. They file tax returns with the IRS. So American charitable foundations can make grants to Tides Canada Foundation. Tides Canada Foundation then re-grants a part of that money to itself, to the Initiative Society. So that's the way that then when Tides Canada Foundation makes grants in Canada, they're made in the name of Tides Canada. So you don't know, for instance, where the grants originated from. And I think it's really important to look at what some of the grants were actually for. For instance, $700,000, and I quote, to slow the expansion of tar sands production by stopping new infrastructure development. Well, I'd like to know, for example, the water quality research that was done on the impact of the oil sands on the Athabasca River. It was done at the same university, funded by the same organization, Tides, published in the same journal, and publicized in the same journal as another set of research that has been used to thwart the salmon farming industry. it's important to know, is that research funded as part and parcel of a demarketing campaign?
You're out of time. So I'd like to just thank all three of you for coming today. The information you've provided to the committee is very helpful indeed. So Jesse Inman, Ian Potter, and Vivian Krause, thank you. We're finished with our meeting for today. Meeting adjourned.